Today, we're diving into a question that's been around for, well, literally thousands of years: male circumcision. It's a practice with deep roots in culture and religion, but what does modern science actually have to say about it?
So let's just get right to the big question, right? Circumcised versus uncircumcised. What's the real difference? Is one actually better for your health, for how things feel, or for your sex life? We're going to dig in and see what the evidence tells us.
You know, to really understand this debate today, we've got to go back in time, because the reasons why people have done this are pretty fascinating, and believe me, they have changed a lot over the years.
Okay, first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about circumcision, we're talking about the surgical procedure to remove the foreskin. That's the sheath of skin that covers the head or glands of the penis.
Now this is where the history gets really wild. It started out thousands of years ago, mostly for cultural and religious reasons. But then, fast forward to the 19th century, and doctors were promoting it to, get this, reduce sexual pleasure and stop masturbation, which they thought caused all sorts of diseases. Pretty weird, right? Then, by the late 1960s, the medical world started to pump the brakes, pointing out the risks, and as you can see, the rates started to drop in places like the US.
And all that back and forth has had a huge global impact. So while it might seem super common where you live, it's estimated that only about a third of all males on the entire planet are actually circumcised.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the modern arguments. Because in the last few decades, the research has swung back again, and now there's a pretty strong medical case for circumcision that's really reignited this whole conversation.
And this is really the heart of it. Modern studies suggest it can lower the risk for some really serious stuff, like penile cancer and a bunch of STIs. Syphilis, herpes, you name it. But the really big ones are HIV and also reducing the risk of female partners getting HPV, which, as you know, is a major cause of cervical cancer.
But if there's one number that really makes you stop and think, it's this one. Major studies have found that circumcision can slash a man's risk of getting HIV by up to 60%. I mean, in the world of public health, a number like that is an absolute game changer.
So you might be asking, how good is that evidence? Well, just look at this. This was a landmark study in Uganda. Over 2.5 years, they tracked couples where one partner had HIV. In the circumcised group of men, not a single one got the virus. 0. But in the uncircumcised group, 40 men contracted HIV. I mean, that difference is just incredibly stark.
So how does this actually work? What's the science here? Well, it pretty much all comes down to microbiology. That little area under the foreskin can basically become a breeding ground for bacteria. In fact, one study found there's an 81% drop in the total amount of bacteria just a year after circumcision. All that extra bacteria in uncircumcised men seems to mess with the body's immune cells, making it harder for them to fight off viruses.
Okay, but that is only one side of the coin. The argument against circumcision really boils down to two main things: the risks of the surgery itself and, maybe even more importantly, the impact it might have on sensation.
And this slide lays out that trade-off perfectly. I mean, obviously, if you don't do the surgery, there's zero surgical risk. And while the risk is pretty low, it's not nothing. But for a lot of people, the bigger deal is sensation. The foreskin is just packed with these specialized nerves. And once it's removed, well, those nerves are gone for good.
And to give you some perspective on that, think about how sensitive your fingertips or your lips are. The nerves in the foreskin are designed to detect that same kind of light touch. In fact, studies have actually shown that the single most sensitive part of an uncircumcised penis is the foreskin itself, more sensitive than any part that's left on a circumcised penis.
So you hear less sensitivity and you probably think, well, that's a bad thing, right? But it turns out the real-world impact on sex is a little more complicated, and one study found something really, really surprising.
And here's where it gets fascinating. For guys who struggle with premature ejaculation, that drop in sensitivity can actually be a huge benefit. In one study, men with this issue found that after getting circumcised, their time to ejaculation went up by almost 10 times. And on top of that, their partners actually reported being more satisfied too.
And of course, we got to touch on the whole looks thing. Is one look better than the other? Well, on this, science is pretty clear. There is no objective better. What people prefer visually almost always just comes down to what they're used to seeing, their own personal or cultural bias.
So we've looked at the health benefits, and we've looked at the arguments about risk and sensation. Where does all of this leave us? Let's try to pull it all together and figure out which one is better.
Well, a good place to start is to see what official medical groups are saying.
The Canadian Pediatric Association, for example, basically says that in a place like North America, where hygiene is good and the risk of STIs is relatively low, the medical benefits just aren't strong enough to recommend it for every single baby boy.
And that really brings us to the single most important takeaway from this whole thing. Context is absolutely everything. In parts of the world where viruses like HIV are a massive problem, those huge health benefits can definitely outweigh the risks.
But on the other hand, for a hygienic person living in a developed country with low infection rates, the purely medical argument for circumcision becomes a whole lot weaker.
Which really leaves us with this final big question to think about. For a lot of people in the world today, is this choice actually about medical data, or is it still, after thousands of years, mostly a cultural one? So, there you have it, our look at the science behind circumcised versus uncircumcised. It's obviously a really complex issue, and we'd love to hear what you think. Which factors do you feel are the most important? Let us know your thoughts and even your preference down in the comments. And if you have questions, drop them there too. If you found this useful, we'd love it if you'd hit like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.